So strategic initiatives for a nonprofit organization. How has the pandemic impacted your current and long-term strategic plan? So this is a little bit of a controversial topic. Some folks will say, what do you mean? Why is it controversial? I can say from whether it's internally at my clients, some of the boards I sit on, some of the discussions with my peers, some will say, how can we plan? How can we have any sort of strategic plan? I don't know what's going to happen the next day. You want me to think about 5 years, 1 year, 1 month, 1 week, 1 day? No way I can do that. Others will come at me and say, I know it's uncertain times, but you know what? We need a plan, because those, as the cliche goes, those that nobody plans to fail, they just fail at planning, and I want at least something down on paper. So with that, obviously the disclaimer, I'm sure some of you have all seen this before, so these are my views, they're not advice. Don't come back to me and say, well, you said that today and I'm gonna sue you. All right, so areas we'll cover is the introduction. We'll talk a little bit about last year and what we talked about at last year's presentation. We'll talk about the challenges, then the good, the bad, the ugly, and we'll keep that theme all the way through when we talk about the impact of COVID, and then some of the strategies and considerations. So I believe most of the folks, when I saw the attendee list, do know me, or at least know of me. But I think this is a good slide because it kind of lays the groundwork of everything that I see and what kind of informs my views as I prepare this presentation. So you can see on the top left, I am a partner on the healthcare tax-exempt team. I have been in public accounting for 20 years, 19 of those at Bonadio, working specifically and focused on healthcare and tax-exempt clients. On the bottom left, the various types of clients I work with them all in this sector: hospitals and health systems, physician groups, behavioral health, higher ed, colleges and universities, both private and public, as well as community-based organizations. So you can see a wide variety throughout the sector. And then in terms of geography, prior to the pandemic, when people say, what office do you work out of? I would say I work out of I-90 in a 2012 Toyota Highlander. But for now, I have been based at 171 in Pittsburgh in our Rochester office. So I do live in upstate New York, but I have gone all over. Over the past 5 years, work has brought me to the exact middle of the country. I've gone to Nebraska. I've gone all the way to the Mexican border to work with a behavioral health organization, and I've gone north of the Adirondacks, and also urban and rural. So I have kind of that wide variety in things I have seen over those years help inform my decisions. And then also the community involvement, and I didn't put this on here just to say, look at me, I give up my time and treasure. I put it there because during the pandemic, I served as a treasurer of 2 nonprofits. I've since moved to the vice chair of Flower City Habitat. So I've sat there and I've talked to the leadership team, I've talked to the CEO teams, and I've talked about what they're going through and tried to help provide guidance and leadership for them to manage through the pandemic. So when we were here last year, for those that attended across the state, we presented about 4 to 5 times across the state. Either myself or Jerry Archibald, who presented yesterday, we talked and we had a presentation on strategies related to merger, acquisition, your mission, or if you could maintain autonomous. What we were saying at the time is there were many challenges in the nonprofit sector. A lot of market forces and a lot of our nonprofit clients were actually saying, hey, should I merge? Should I acquire? Should I affiliate? What should I do? At that time, Jerry and myself had predicted that there would be a market force coming down on the nonprofit sector. At that time, I really believed it would be at that time, the state fiscal crisis and what that fiscal crisis would do from a funding situation as well as a demographic situation. Little did we know that the pandemic was coming down the road, and that really was the market force that has shook up the nonprofit industry. But last year, the 4th bullet point here is last year's takeaway wasn't necessarily you needed to merge or acquire, or you need to have a strategy for those market forces. It was a matter of you need to plan. You need to have a culture and the infrastructure in place to address those challenges, and would it be merging, acquisition, and affiliations. And a little bit of an update on where the M&A world is obviously during the pandemic we saw it take a step back, but now we're actually seeing it pick back up again. We started multiple projects of folks coming to us saying, hey, we're really looking at this as an option, as a viable option for the future. Can you take a look, help us with forecasting, help us with facilitation between the boards? So those projects are, again, on the uptick. So with that, I will launch polling question number 1. Just bear with me. All right. Since the pandemic, has your organization performed strategic planning? I'm going to open that up. And I am actually curious about that answer. Today, I'm not going to sit here and talk about strategic planning, more kind of you saw on the agenda, more what the focus is. But I do want to know where folks are with this in terms of what they're talking about internally or also externally, and see what the results are. It kind of relates to what I talked about market forces, and also what I'll be talking about in a minute. I can tell you while I wait for the minute, we got about one more minute left. On the boards I'm on, we really haven't engaged these conversations. We talk about it. We say, where are the partners? What are we thinking about? Do we have the right infrastructure? What if someone came to us? So we're at least kind of talking about it, but we don't have a formal process. So I would say probably our response would be C. So we got about 20 or so seconds. Oh, someone put in there complete and true, but they would probably answer A, B, and C. So not all the above. So they're probably all over the place. Maybe what they're saying is someone brought up, this is a good idea, we go down this path, and they start it, and then they kind of stop it. So are we all right? So just by way for everyone to know, about 1/3 of this group has at least held a meeting, on it. I'd say 1/3, about 1/6 of the group has held a meeting, or at least started something. So that was B and C. And then actually 16% of you, 20% of you said, are you kidding me? We don't have time to do that. And I'm actually a little bit more surprised. About 1/3 has said we've held a meeting with the senior leadership team. I thought more would have been in D. So challenges in the nonprofit sector. And again, I think this kind of lays out where the conversation is going to go today. So I'll try to go through these. I know it might be small on your screen. We will route around on the presentations after this. But let's just kind of focus on a high level. And when I put this together, I do recognize that this is a wide variety across the sector of various types of organizations, especially here today. We got higher ed involved, we got hospitals involved, we got healthcare, community-based organizations. So I'll try to speak generally to it. But one of the things we've seen on that top left is the emergence of digital and online. So whether you'll hear me make a theme, kind of a statement, maybe 3 or 4 times today, that the pandemic increased the speed and scale use of telehealth by 10 years. So yes, that's in healthcare or human services, but we've also seen it in higher education and going to online learning. We've also seen it in terms of advocacy efforts and saying, let's have a Zoom meeting to do our advocacy. And we've also seen it in fundraising. How many had a virtual gala this year? I know both the boards I'm on actually had virtual galas, and they actually ended up being successful. And now we're looking at year 2 saying we're not off to a good of a start. But that digital and online operations ramped up very quickly. And we look at right next to that, to the right, the New York State fiscal crisis. I think everybody on this should be very well aware of it. Between the governor and comptroller, they're I guess in a disagreement about how much it is. Some say it's $6 million. I think on the comptroller side, billion. The governor has said anywhere in his press conferences over the next 5 years, I need $71 billion. A lot of that hinges on the 3rd round of stimulus, the American Rescue Plan, the Joe Biden American Rescue Plan. Hopefully, they're looking at $350 billion going out to states, local governments, etc. And what New York State will get from that, whether it's $6 billion or $15 billion, the difference between that can be draconian cuts, or it can be rainbows and butterflies because the money will be just flowing. But not only when you think about the fiscal crisis, you could say, well, I'm not really primarily funded by New York State, or I'm not part of the Medicaid program. Again, I highlighted this when we talked about last year. What could the demographic effects be if New York State has to have a higher tax rate? Who could leave? Who could you end up serving? How could that shift change you when New York State's in a fiscal crisis? The one to the right of that, shift in payment models, and some might say, John, that's a healthcare term, but I'm seeing that all across the sector. People are asking about value and what are we paying for, how do we bundle it, and how do we price it and get paid for it. I'm going to go back to the one to the right of that, administrative sophistication, after I finish the bottom row. So the workforce, going into the pandemic, our workforce in our sector was in a crisis. No matter where you were having issues, what type of organization you were having issues trying to find good skilled labor to do the direct care, to do the lower end work, or even the higher end work. There was still very hard and competitive labor market. Some of the things we have seen, we've had conversations with our clients, and they're telling us their turnover rates are high. Someone told us just last week it was at 40%. Vacant positions, 20%. An example I said previously is we had one client say, if you take away the senior leadership team, 95% of my staff have not been here more than 2 years. So there's a cost to that turnover. And again, the labor shortage, even though we say the unemployment rate is higher, there's still a labor shortage. The numbers I believe I saw today come out, they said the unemployment rate was 6.3%, but really that they believe that many people have left the job market that is probably more about 8.3 to 9%. You do the math on that, that's about 200 to 300 people have just left the job market. To the right of that, the increased mental health concerns, and this is for everybody. No matter what type of organization you are, we're all dealing with pressures, change in how we work. Who knows what's going on at home? If you're like me, I'm educating. Well, not me. My wife is educating helping to educate the children. But I got 3 kids going to 3 different schools, and my wife is going to a different school. So we have 4 separate schedules. So how am I juggling that? How are my employees juggling that? Then to the next of it, consumerism. Yes, this is a healthcare term, but this kind of relates to the value. And I see this in other organizations, including in higher ed. People are saying, I want the right service at the right place at the right time that's meant for me. And you're having to look at that as an organization and say, how do I deal with that? And then lastly, the impact on the supply chain. So are we getting enough PP&E, cleaning supplies, etc.? Or if you're thinking about a strategic investment, we need to build a building, we need to get this new piece of equipment. Your supply chain is so slowed up that you're having to plan so far in advance for it. And then lastly, kind of going back up to I'm going to go back up to the top right, in the administrative sophistication. What this term means is it relates to the other 7 items I discussed in terms of those challenges. But with all those challenges you're facing in the change of the world, more reliance on data to be successful, more information technology structure, more compliance requirements, more ways to finance things, more different ways to deliver your services. Do you have the sophistication? Are you specialized enough? Can you keep up? And then that comes to a whole other set of questions. Are the skills available? Is it available in the labor market? And what are you going to have to pay for it? And then if you have to overpay for it, where's the funding coming from that? So yes, a lot of challenges. And we'll go to the next slide. All right, polling question number 2. Launch it. Related to a remote workforce, the following applies to your organization. A, we never went remote and has been business as usual. B, we have welcomed back our employees to work on site. C, we are still remote but have a plan to come back within the next 12 months. Or D, we accelerated our plan to welcome back our employees onto a work site. And again, this is one I'm interested too, so as we go through the minute for the responses. What we did at Bonadio was we did shut down for 2 months. On March 16th, I was getting text messages from one of my friends who works at one of the hospitals saying, you got to get out of there. So I grabbed my second monitor, I grabbed a couple other things, put it in my bag, and went home and said I didn't know what work was going to look like then, for the foreseeable future, and I didn't know when I'd be stepping back into the office. Our offices never technically closed, but we were encouraged to work from home as much as we could. I did not come back to Bonadio. I think I stepped into the office mid-June. We opened up our doors. We took all the right protocols. And June 28th, we reopened and welcomed our staff back. Throughout the summer, in fall, we probably had about a 50 to 60% capacity. We are encouraging folks to come back more in here into our offices to help really assist them with really their career and professional development and making sure they're engaged. So you'll hear when I talk a little bit later, I'll use some of those examples as well. So where we are with the polling, we got a few seconds left. So of the responses so far, we have probably about 10% of you actually never went remote. 40% of you have welcomed back your employees, and 30% of you are still remote but have a plan to come back in 12 months. And actually 3 of you have said you've accelerated your plans. And let's see what came in. And then we had one comment come in that they're going to do a mix of remote and on-site labor in the future. Historically, they were all mainly on-site, but they're going to find many more, but they found they are more productive remotely. That's actually a comment I have in a little bit. All right, so the good, the bad, and the ugly. Those that know me know that it's probably killing me not to actually have a picture from the Clint Eastwood movie up to play into this cliche. But as I presented for this, I know that there was some good that occurred, there was some bad and the ugly. The ugly is kind of how I fit this in. So it's really more the good, the bad, and what risks or what unintended consequences occurred because of shifts in your operations. One thing I know what we can do is we can sit back and we can, as a sector, we can learn and we can reflect. So what did we learn about our business that was good? Have you asked those questions? What did we do differently that was successful? What did we do differently we didn't think that we could have done 12 months ago? What did we learn about our business that was bad? Well, what didn't work out? In hindsight, we probably wouldn't have made that same decision. Maybe if you want to put something in the chat, if you wanted to share, so I'll share one of them, is what did we do differently that I didn't think was possible 12 months ago? And that is essentially what we did this week with the nonprofit sector and having these webinars go so smoothly. For those that know, on the higher ed side, I help assist with hosting higher education trainings. On February 28th, we had an in-person training, and watching that morning as you're supposed to be paying attention to the stock market drop and knew something was going on. And we had that event in person in Rochester, but we had plans to take that across the state. And suddenly, within 2 weeks, those plans changed, and we said, let's try to do this online. And there was a lot of trepidation because we had to set up the presenters. We had to make sure the technology was there. How was I going to get everybody's CPE? And I thought we could do it, but there was a lot of, guys, let's buckle up, let's do this. And now I look at to where we are right now, and I say, look, we can do this. It's turnkey operations. Someone says, I want to host a client webinar. We have 106 people on right now. It's turnkey. I get an email, submit the presentation. We're here today, and you're gonna get CPE. But with a lot of that new things we're doing, there's unforeseen risks. Some of them is unclear government regulation. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Is there a new competitor? I know some folks have sat there and said, hey, now that I can do telehealth, I can provide it to a wider market share. And the response I had to that is, oh yeah? Guess what? That also means somebody else can come into your market share as well. I talked about the increased administrative infrastructure sophistication. Can you keep up with all this new changes in your business? Do you have the right people in place? And then the need for capital resources. So what kind of investments do you need to make to actually continue on with this new line of business or this change in your business operations? And then continuing on the risks. How has this impacted your organization? So again, what changes do you think were good? What was bad? I think when we think about what was bad, I think some of those were underlying issues, and the pandemic exacerbated them. So ask yourself when you do this analysis, was it directly related to the pandemic, and did the pandemic really expose it? Is it a short-term or long-term problem? Do you need to address that problem today? Or, hey, once we kind of get to that new normal, it's going to go away. Or, no, you know what, this really is a long-term risk to us. And that kind of speaks to, is it worth changing now? Again, but what can you learn from it? And then again, did those internal and external changes bring on additional risks to your organization? And I put this in here. This kind of popped out at me What I like to do is when I walk my dog, when it's not 10 degrees and the wind blowing at your face with somehow a sleet, even though it's 10 degrees, I like to put on some podcasts and listen to them and reflect and think. Though my wife said me and my dog would have a healthy relationship if we actually talked to each other and didn't just walk, but I think she's happy. What I heard someone say, and they were talking about a lot of the events of 2020, and it took 6 days into 2021, and it kind of started back up again. And they said a lot of people are really pessimistic about the future, but when you look back at the past, you should be optimistic. And kind of what I mean about this, and I think it's important for this sector to hear this, is, our country and us as a sector, we've gone through a Great Depression. We've gone through a World War. We've gone through the Civil Rights Movement. We've gone through Vietnam with a draft. We've gone through the Great Recession. I think about being born and raised in Rochester. I was around that time where when I was in grade school and middle school, I saw Kodak get much smaller, and I saw a lot of my friends' parents actually lose their jobs or take quote-unquote early retirement. And I look at it, and we're still here, and we're still surviving. And look at everything we've gotten through. And yes, this was hard, but we can get through it. We've stepped up to those challenges before. So when I kind of heard this quote, I thought, geez, that's a good way to think about it. And I realized some of the topics I'm bringing up and talking about on a Friday afternoon can be a little bit heavy. So I want everyone to know that I am very optimistic on the future and our ability to get through this. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the functional areas of what I see in my client base, what I see at the organizations I serve, and kind of what I get a sense of what's going on. So the first one is remote work, and I do have some of the comments that came in. Some are going hybrid. Basically, the 3 comments that came in is pretty much hybrid, and they think they're going to stay that way. When I first put this together, and I said, as the auditor, remote work, and I had one slide between remote work and internal controls, and then I really thought about it. The first slide really is more of a management and a people issue. So we looked at what went really well with remote work, and it promotes a good work-life balance. For me, I got to spend more time, be around my kids. I wasn't in the car at least 25 minutes here, 25 minutes back, let alone when I go to the client. It was just time better served with my kids. A promotion of the employee well-being. Research shows increased productivity, such as I got in the chat. And then some folks were saying, hey, I can save on occupancy costs. So that was part of what was really good from remote work. The bad, and yes, this is a business problem we're seeing here, and this is a business problem I'm seeing at a lot of my nonprofits as well. So are all of your employees engaged? And are they engaged in your mission? Or do they feel it, or are they just kind of the day-to-day, this is my job? Again, are they receiving the right mentoring and development? If they're not growing as employees, how is your business going to grow? The isolation and blurred lines between work and home. So one of mine is my daughter, for some reason, on Thursdays has a very early afternoon, a afternoon basketball practice. I've been able to say, I'll take you. But what that does, and sometimes there's been important phone calls, so I'll drop her off, I'll step outside, and I'll sit at a table with my mask on, and I'll do the work call. That's fine with me, but the blurred line becomes when people start saying, can you do this every week? And then other folks will say, well, I work in my kitchen, and I get up, and hey, I'm never really off the clock because I can always see my email. That's causing a lot of stress on people. And again, the mental health at working from home. Like I said, you're either always with your family or always at work. Those blurred lines, you never know when the right time. You never feel like you can officially unwind. So what are the risks to your business related to this? And it's something I've seen at quite a few clients is really, do you have a culture and a common purpose? And what we're seeing, especially with remote work environments, is we're seeing kind of those niches or I guess cliques that are already there maybe are getting a little bit exacerbated because that's who you talk to more regularly without seeing the other person. Also what this means are some folks more willing to come back into the office while some are staying at home. And then people questioning why are they here, who's not, and really making sure you're managing what the overall culture of your organization, what your secret sauce is. I mentioned a little bit before, how can you grow your mission if your employees are not engaged? Are they just doing the day-to-day process, or are they saying, how can I learn and develop? And then lastly, how are you effectively communicating and holding employees accountable? And I like to say this is the inherent tension between treating people as professionals and also saying it's time to get dressed. Some people actually are very successful working in their pajamas, others not so much. So those are some of the risks with really the remote work environment, just related to personal and management. But then we get to the internal control structure, and there was a sudden change, and your accounting and finance staff had to adjust. The good, we took away some redundant and legacy processes. The board I am on, one of the boards I'm on, we actually had a check signing, our dual check signing authorization was $1,000, and at the time I was a treasurer, I'd get the monthly bank statement, and I have to sit there through 40 pages and make sure all of them had dual signatures. And I was always like, guys, we can raise this a little bit up. And then the pandemic finally allowed me to get that up to 5,000, and also allowed us to kind of put in, hey, we could do this process a little bit better. Another one we've seen organizations, they've invested in an electronic purchase order system all the way through cutting the check. Everything was electronic. And then you would go out there and you talk to the AP clerk, and she'd have a file this big. And we'd say, what are you doing? I thought you were electronic. Well, I am. I just don't trust it yet. Well, guess what? When she went home and couldn't print everything out, now she was forced to actually use the efficiency of the system that they invested on. And that also kind of relates to that third bullet of the streamlined reporting. What is the bad? Were you able to maintain appropriate segregation of duties? You separate the authorization, custody, and record keeping. So that's that triangle segregation of duties. So maybe for the first couple of weeks you said, hey, it's a pandemic, we can get through this. It's okay if we kind of cut this out for a little bit, we'll pick it up. But we're 11 months into it, and I had one case where I heard one of the directors of finance, a controller of one of my organizations, she brought the checks home with her. I said, I get what you're doing everything, what's in the best interest, but do you really think you should be sitting with the checks there? But we take every circumstance, and she went through and told me the mitigating controls, and I said, okay, but that's just kind of one example of a breakdown in internal controls. Are your reconciliations being performed timely? This kind of relates back to the previous slide with the remote work and holding people accountable. So if you're not reconciling timely, are you really getting accurate financial information to make very critical decisions? And that relates to the statistical information. Is your operations folks, are they talking with your finance people? They're doing statistics. How do we do to budget? How do we do to actual? Do you really know what occurred if you're working offsite in the internal control structure, and you're making the right decisions? And then some of the risks related to the work from home with the internal control structure is information security and privacy risk. I mean, it's cliche, but it's right there. If I'm working at home in my office and I have some medical records or I have some student information up, and I don't have a 16-year-old daughter, but for theory of this, my 16-year-old daughter looks over my shoulder and sees her friend's name, you have a privacy risk right there. Also, all the information going back and forth, on this information superhighway, you've allowed more access to it. So it increases some of those risks. Can you cross-train employees? I think you've seen the theme of this. If you got to engage them, cross-train them, do other tasks. It's part of your succession plan. It could be part of succession planning, especially if someone says, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I got the kids. I got to worry about that. That person leaves. Who's stepping in? Well, nobody was cross-trained, and they're home, and now your internal control structure is no longer working as intended. And then lastly, the policies and procedures. It's no longer relevant. I'm sure you all have a lovely policies and procedures manual that's up on the shelf, and it's not worth the weight that in paper it's printed on. And that's because it probably wasn't relevant beforehand, but you whipped it out when the auditor asked you to, and probably now it's less relevant. All right, polling question number 3. Related to cost per unit. So this is a little bit of a segue into what I'm going to be talking about. So related to cost per unit, we know what our cost per unit is. We knew what our cost per unit was, but the pandemic has caused us to no longer know, or see, we never knew our cost per unit. So I'll open that up, and while you're answering, I'll kind of segue right into this. So well, really, I said cost is king, but we all know cash is king. But cost is still very, very, very important. And do you know the true cost of your programs? We've talked about shifting and changing your operations. Maybe some of you might have slightly changed what your mission was or how you actually think about your mission in delivery of services. So with that said, do you actually know what it costs you to do those services? So what was good? Most organizations have actually experienced savings in travel, meals, entertainment, office supplies, routine R&M. I see that. We're starting our audits up. I can see the preliminary trial balances, and those savings are real. Someone told me they saved on occupancy costs because obviously we no longer need the footprint, so we're going to save on occupancy costs. And then others said we use this as an opportunity to trim the low-hanging fruit, trim the fat, the low-hanging fruit, the belt, wasteful and unnecessary spending. This was our time to make those changes. So that was all good. On the bad side was you had increased costs related to technology. Remember, use of digital infrastructure has advanced, so you need to invest in more technology. I talked about the cost related to delays in the supply chain. You can see the polling question that I will look at the results, but do you actually know what your cost per unit is? So of the results, I will say a quarter of you actually do know what your true cost per unit was. Another quarter of you actually did know what it was at one point, but no longer know it. And another quarter of you just said, there's only three. Sorry. Well, another quarter of you said we never knew what our actual cost per unit was. And then the last quarter actually didn't answer the question. So it's actually quite evenly distributed throughout in terms of this cost per unit. What this means also in terms of the bad is something I've always said is, are you cost cutting in the wrong places? And nobody has ever cut their way to greatness. And one of the risks is people are cost cutting in compliance, internal audit, information technology. They might not be doing it intentionally. They might say, hey, someone left us, we're just not going to replace that position. And you're going to see on a couple next slides maybe why you don't want to be doing that. So the risk, your cost structure is a moving target. You don't really know what it is. How can you plan that for the future? How can you make decisions for this year's budget or your 3 to 5 year budget if you keep one? How can you make the correct and informed decisions? Also, have you exposed your organization to higher risk of fraud or waste and abuse because of some of these cost cutting? I will say, because of the pandemic, I do believe, and I haven't quite seen it yet in my client base, but I think we can all make an educated guess that fraud has gone up. I talked about the unemployment rate going up earlier. We've talked about the pressures on people. And when people have those type of pressures, they turn to the vices, such as substance abuse or gambling. And what I've seen across my career, especially related to gambling, is when someone is gambling, that's when they're actually going to their employer and committing fraud. And when you have nothing else going on, and you can actually now go to your iPhone and you can gamble very easily. So it's something I'm encouraging all of you to be thinking about. Did we cut too much, and what does our internal control structure look like? Okay. What do we got next? All right, government regulations. So in the beginning, I thought it was pretty good, especially going back to my example of telehealth. There was relaxing of government regulations. It really assisted the nonprofits in delivering their mission. It made it easier. It made it easier to get paid for those services. Heck, anytime a government regulation is relaxed, it makes life a lot easier. But there's a reason sometimes we have government regulations, that they are for the good. But the bad part of that is, how could one be expected to keep up with all those changing in regulations? Sometimes the regulation will only be for 60 days. Do you know when it started? Do you know when it expired? Was there a difference between federal and state? And add top on that, probably the person that was in charge of tracking all that was working from home. One of the ways they were always informed on what the changes in regulations were annually, they were going to compliance conferences, or they were talking to their colleagues, being more collegial, and they probably weren't hearing about those. And a lot of that, and also future regulations coming down the pipe, they were putting their planning on hold. So there was really kind of, the bad is just trying to keep up with all these changes, and it just brought additional pressure. So the risk there is, are you in compliance with the government regulations? I'd say pre-pandemic, you probably probably there was no way you could have known you were in compliance with all regulations. I had one client count for me, and they said they had to count all the government regulations and forms they had to file. They got up to 670 of them. So just imagine that once the pandemic starts making it change. All right, mission and margin. This has been a conversation that I've had with multiple clients and even the boards I am at. So I kind of think about the two examples. I'm on the Flower City Habitat for Humanity board as well as the Rochester Academy of Medicine. And we've looked at how we're delivering our mission and what has changed. And I believe other nonprofits are looking at this as well. One thing we've done at Flower City Habitat is we used to sit there and say, well, we built, what do we do? What is our number one number when someone says, what did you do? And we come back and we say, well, we built 15 houses. And now we're looking at it, and this is something we were talking about before the pandemic, and the national affiliation was telling us as well. We really got to focus on families served. But the pandemic really forced us, because we couldn't, during the pandemic, build houses, and it's going to take a while to ramp back up. We couldn't go and say, well, we built 5 houses. We had to say, how can we make that number and let everyone know we were involved in the community? And we switched it to family served. And now we're counting that in a different way. And I'm not just saying that to have a feel-good story or pat ourselves on the back. But what it made me sit there and do, as someone with a finance background and a finance background in nonprofits on the board, is I came back and I said, okay, how do we know what this really costs us when we say family served? We started a whole new program. Sure, it sounded great, but what does this cost us and what are we bringing in? Have we asked the right questions? What's the margin here? Oh, we don't quite close the gap on the margin. Great. What do we need to subsidize in order to get there? What do we need from fundraising? What do we need from government? What do we need from government grants? And we really need to, one of the things is we need to answer those questions in order to plan for the future. So you can see some of the good. I talked about, I provided an example of a new service line that we were doing. Government funders have subsidized operations. That second bullet down under the good. So we've talked about the PPP loan, PRF, that's provider relief. We've seen that in health and human service agencies. HERF, that's for higher education. That's Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. So government funders have come in and provided an ample amount of funding. Very good. We've also seen private donations soar. Knock on wood that we continue to stay there, and that continues through 2021. But what's been bad from that? I talked a little bit earlier about burdensome regulations and changes in rules to government programs. I can say this with all that alphabet soup of government funders. How many people today out of 1231, if you've received PPP funding and provider relief funding, know what your actual revenue you're going to recognize is? I'd be very surprised if anybody on this webinar could actually answer that question. Same thing we've seen in some of our colleges. It's been an ongoing discussion of what really is our revenue target once we take all that. So again, if you don't really know what your revenue is, how are you making an informed decision on what those service lines are? This second bullet there, have you pulled away from your core mission? Hey, our core mission was X, but we realized because of the pandemic we needed to do Y. Is that really what you should be invested in? Is that going to be profitable for the future? Especially if you're using government funding to subsidize your startup costs. And then have those new service lines that started without robust strategic plans or internal control structure and proper oversight. Hey, it was good, you started it up, but did you really think about it? Did you really think this is going to be profitable? Did you really think about the flow of information? Did you think about where you're sending someone off and they weren't reporting and you gave them a bag of cash and said, go get them? Was there the right internal control structure? I've seen a little bit of that too. So again, the risk. Do you really understand what that revenue of that program is and that new service? How can you evaluate that per unit revenue? I know we're nonprofits, and John, you talk about per unit cost, per unit revenue. We're not going to get into activity-based costing. But these are things we need to ask. What is the ROI on that new program? And then if we start a new program, how are we going to keep our donors engaged? Are they going to say, hey, this is the way we always did something, and I gave you $50,000 a year to do it this way, and now you're telling me your mission changed or it's slightly changed? So you've got to think about the risks of some of those new programs you're starting. All right, liquidity. This is something I love to talk about. We first saw it probably, the conversation in the nonprofit sector started a couple years up. It became part of your required disclosure in your financial statements with the nonprofit standard. So now we started to put the liquidity footnote right there into the financial statements. And what I mean when I talk about liquidity, I don't just talk about your cash in the bank. It's really what all your financial assets are. It's your cash in the bank, it's your investments, what's your receivables, but also what access to line of credits do you have. And what this did was it put a focus on what that number really was, what really your liquidity was. At a couple of one of the boards I'm on, they said, John, this was a whole new way of looking at it, and you really helped inform. We really helped inform the board of what we were doing, not just with the cash in the bank, but also those investments that were, unrestricted, but they weren't, the board maybe didn't want to see us spending them. What we started to do, starting at the beginning of the pandemic, now every month we look at what our liquidity is and how many days of cash on hand, cash and investments on hand we have every month. And then we can also see what the burn rate is. So if we started at 14 months, 13, 12, 11, that says to me, hey, we're burning through operations probably every month that goes by, we're burning it through. And then we can also see what levers we can pull from it, or what government funding and how that helps us, or when donations help us. And we can actually make better informed decisions. And then when we go to the board, we can say, guys, look, we're trying to evaluate when the new normal's coming, when we can get back to normal operations and back to normal income streams, but I'm not sure if that wall's going to hit us beforehand. So I think that's been good from that angle. The bad is extreme cash pressure can force irrational decision making. And what I mean by that is you look up and you say, I got 2 days of days cash on hand. How am I going to cut payroll? How am I going to pay this vendor? Everyone's calling me. You're under pressure. You're probably not making the right decision. So the other part is, with all the uncertainty, what is the right liquidity and reserve portion for the organization to utilize the balance sheet and drive return on income statement? Because you're saying, hey, the government came through, we got the PPP, we got some other sources, our balance sheet's really strong right now, but should I hoard that? Or should I invest in something? Should I invest back in the program? Should I invest in something that I think is new normal? People really are struggling to make those decisions. All right, polling question number 4. Related to reporting of key performance indicators, so those KPIs, what you're reporting to your board. A, the pandemic has changed the KPIs we monitor. B, because of the pandemic, we plan to change the KPIs we monitor. C, we have not changed the KPIs we monitor. And D, we do not monitor KPIs. And while you are answering the poll, just kind of look at the chat. When I was kind of talking about on the previous slide about when we were talking about kind of the mission, the margin, the government funders, someone came in, and I agree with you. I definitely agree with this comment. This has been a theme. No one knows what the comment came in. No one knows, and we're still facing the possibility that New York State will consider those funds double dipping. So what they're saying is, yes, we got the cash in the bank from the government sources, but I don't really know if I can hold on to those, and it's probably making it very tough to make decisions. Along those lines, one of the organizations we work with, and I believe them to be very sophisticated, very bright, very smart folks, very, very on top of things. We said, hey, what's your 2021 budget look like? And this was in January, and they said, we haven't finished our budget. We don't know what government sources are coming. How can you expect us to budget? So again, there is a risk from the pandemic. All right, so this is the final slide I have, but some strategies and considerations, and you can kind of see that as it related to the polling question I had asked. Just let me flip and see where the answers are coming. Got a couple more seconds on the poll. Let me just, all right. So what the poll said is, of those that answered, approximately 20% of you have actually changed the key performance indicators. About 6% of you, 8% of you, have said because of the pandemic you plan to change the key performance indicators. A majority of you, about 40% of you, said we're not changing those, and 25% of you, so about 1/4 of you, said we don't actually monitor KPIs. I'll kind of lay into that once we get into the strategy and consideration. So one of the main strategies is reflect. Kind of think about what we talked about. Take a deep breath, step back, ask yourself a lot of these questions about what went well, what went bad, what risks, what unintended consequences did that create, and how can you use that to plan. So reporting to governance, and this relates to the poll question. Have you changed your meeting structure? Do you have different KPIs? What are the reports of the committees? Are you out of silos? An example this relates to is we had a client come to us, and this client was always had enough cash, always had enough investments. They had a very strong balance sheet, had a very good donor pool, and they were able to always invest back into programs and have large capital projects. And we picked up the phone and we said, hey, how are things going? And they essentially said, I got a case of the shorts. And we said, well, what do you mean? You've always been strong. Well, because we were always strong, we never actually monitored what really our cash, what our liquidity was. We never had KPIs to show us what our operations were. We never really understood what was paying for the projects. And now we kind of need to start all over and actually have a robust budgeting process. And we said, well, what could you have done differently? And they said, our governance, who's been very strong, very sophisticated, the report we were providing them meant nothing to them. And they never really pushed the issue because we just gave them the regular old, this is what the balance sheet looks like, this is what the income statement looks like, and this is what we're going to do. So what we're seeing in terms of KPIs, I talked about it earlier, about look at your operational areas. What is going on in your human resources? Have you tracked your open positions? Have you tracked your turnover? When we look at the balance sheet, I talked about liquidity, always looking at what your days available cash are, maybe what your current ratio and how's that trending. Your debt, for those with debt service ratio, that's one I always like to look at. But also what your margins are. And it's just your operating margin, your cash flow margin. That's something I always kind of focus on when I look at it. And the difference between those two is essentially the difference between operating margin and cash flow margin is essentially taking depreciation out. But then also some parts about reporting to governance. How are you reporting differently at the committee level? Have you changed how the board, what your structure is to report? Are you having committees step up and say, hey, this is the true report from the committee. I'm not just relying on the CEO. I'm not just kind of showing up and not giving it my best effort because it's 5 minutes at the board and it's not like I'm getting paid. Are you having more structures as committees? And then I say out of silos, especially when you talk about these new service lines that are, at least maybe not new service lines, but different ways of looking at your mission. And hey, we need fundraising here. Or what does this add to the bottom line? How do these two, when we provide more than one service to the same family, are we talking about it with each other? And what do we need to do to get out of the silo of I did A, I did B, we could probably do better with C. And a lot of that occurs at reporting to governance. In strategic planning, I promised I wasn't going to go into a long dissertation on this, but at least have you started asking some of those questions? Have you done a SWOT analysis, so strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats? We've actually completed these recently for a couple of clients, looking at what the internal and the external threats are, looking at how that related to your KPIs, looking at how that changed your business model, and then saying, what can we do differently? Where do we need to make our investments? Or what do we need to divest from? What service have we been providing for 20 years that's probably no longer relevant, no longer keeping that dog? And then how are you addressing those challenges you're facing? So you've done some sort of analysis, whether it's your senior leadership team, your directors, how you face each other, and you've done that analysis and you've gone back and you're making more informed decisions. Enterprise-wide risk assessment, not just thinking about from the IT or compliance basis, but now things have changed. Have you sat down and talked about where is the risk to this organization? What could go wrong, whether it's in our internal controls? What could go wrong with our compliance, quality assurance, and information security? I can tell you, information security is under attack. The types of information that the nonprofit sector organizations have, whether it's health records, student records, any type of record, you have a ton of information, but you might not have the necessary sophistication, and the bad guys, the hackers, know about that, and they're putting you under attack. So have you assessed what you're doing relative to protect your vital information? And then also, do you have, this one's come up, and I typed this out, and as I rehearsed for this, I go, geez, have I asked this question to my own board? Do you have the appropriate business insurance? If you change certain service lines, are you actually insured for that? Are you insured correctly? If something went wrong, would your carrier come back? Have you at least asked that question? And then financial forecast and planning. This is something I like to do. I enjoy it. I always kind of think about it. But one of the things, I'm not saying take on a whole project, but you've been doing things, especially over the last 11 months of the pandemic. And maybe performing this exercise of financial forecast and planning, you're validating the path you're on. You're validating the assumptions. You're validating what you think is going to happen and say, hey, we're on the right path. You're understanding what those operational indicators, where do you need to be with your turnover? How many people do you need to serve? What price point or margin point do you actually need to stay successful? And then also that will show you the levers that are available, when you need to manage cash, when your working capital is up or when your working capital is down. What levers can you pull to actually manage cash better? And then do you have the strategy to develop reserves? And some of you are probably saying, John, we don't even know what to do with our cash, but the next day you're talking about reserves. Some of that new equipment that might be coming grant funded, some of these items you're investing in terms of these new service lines, guess what? It's going to need to be replaced soon. Or guess what? You might have had a really good cash balance prior to going into the pandemic and things didn't go so well and you used up those reserves. Did you develop a strategy to respond and redevelop those reserves? Then lastly, it sounds a little cliche, but have you thanked your employees? They've really busted their hump. Whether they've been on the front lines or behind the scenes, everyone's under stress. And I think sometimes it's just the little things to let them know you're thinking about them. Reaching out, talking about something about not work. That is the type of stuff that will keep them more engaged, more of them growing and developing, and they're going to assist you with growing and developing. All right. I think that concludes it. So we got about 5 minutes left. So I'll look at the chat, see if there's any questions or comments. I think I got them all thus far. So anyone have anything to add via the chat? I know it's literally I'm between you and the weekend when he performs at the Super Bowl. Oh, thank you very much. So with that, I will give you back 5 minutes of your day. Hope everyone has an enjoyable weekend and stay safe. And hopefully I'll be seeing some of you in person soon. Thank you.